The late afternoon sun hung low over Clearwater, Virginia, casting a golden glow over the peaceful town. The streets were quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves as the autumn wind swept through the tree-lined avenues. It was a typical Tuesday, the kind that seemed to promise nothing more than routine. Yet, for Sophia Walker, it was the beginning of something that would change everything. Sophia, a beloved third-grade teacher at Ridgewood Elementary, walked briskly across the school's parking lot, her heels clicking against the pavement as she gathered her belongings. The last bell had just rung, and the chaos of a day filled with eager young voices had finally settled into silence. She was tired, but satisfied. It had been another fulfilling day, filled with small victories, the child who finally understood long division, the parent who praised her for her patience. But beneath the professional calm she projected, Sophia's thoughts were often elsewhere. Her marriage to Ethan Walker was slowly suffocating her. From the outside, they looked like the perfect couple, successful careers, a comfortable home, and a well-established routine. Yet behind closed doors, their relationship was anything but harmonious. For years, Sophia had tried to maintain the optimism she brought into their marriage. But Ethan's growing indifference, his lack of ambition, and his quiet resentment toward her success had taken their toll. They were two strangers, living in the same house, bound by the weight of unmet expectations. As Sophia unlocked her car door and slid into the driver's seat, she took a deep breath, hoping the evening ahead would be different. She'd long ago stopped looking for the warmth she once felt from Ethan. She had grown used to the cold silence between them, the separation that had slowly crept into their lives. Tonight, she hoped, they could talk, truly talk, for once. Maybe they could finally confront the cracks in their marriage. But as she sat there, staring at her phone, ready to text Ethan, something didn't feel right. It was the quiet. The sound of tires rolling over the asphalt seemed to fade into the background, and a chill settled in her chest. She glanced around, but the parking lot remained eerily empty. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the otherwise deserted area. No one was around, and yet she felt the sudden, unsettling sensation that someone, was watching her. Then it happened. Before she could react, a rough hand clamped over her mouth, yanking her backward. She struggled, but the grip was firm, strong, and far too familiar. She gasped for breath, her mind racing in confusion and fear, but the hand didn't loosen. Instead, a man's voice, gruff and distorted, whispered coldly in her ear. "Don't scream. Just do as I say, and you'll be fine." Her heart pounded in her chest as the world around her blurred, her legs giving way as she was shoved into the back of a van. The engine roared to life, and the van tore off, its tires screeching against the pavement, leaving a trail of dust in the air. The feeling of being taken, of being completely powerless, gripped Sophia as the vehicle sped away, further from the safety of her school, further from the life she had known. Somewhere in the distance, Ethan Walker sat in their quiet home, unaware of the storm that was about to engulf them both. Ethan Walker had always felt like he was chasing something just out of reach, something he couldn't quite name. Growing up in the small town of Clearwater, Virginia, Ethan was the youngest of 3 children. His older brother, David, excelled at everything. A natural athlete, popular and outgoing, David was the golden child. Then there was his younger sister, Emily, who charmed everyone with her quick wit and infectious energy. Ethan, by contrast, was ordinary. Unremarkable, some might say. He wasn't bad-looking, but he lacked the charisma that had earned his siblings praise and attention. From a young age, Ethan learned to live in their shadows. David's sports trophies lined the mantel, while Emily's academic awards were plastered on the fridge. Ethan's achievements, however small, went largely unnoticed. Even his parents, Bill and Karen Walker, seemed to care more about what David and Emily were doing than their quiet, introverted youngest child. Ethan's sense of mediocrity followed him into adulthood like a shadow, constantly whispering in his ear that he would never measure up. After high school, Ethan attended a local community college, scraping by with average grades. He earned a business degree, but without the drive to excel or the social skills to network, his career trajectory was always flat. Upon graduation, he found work as an insurance salesman at a small firm, a job that paid the bills but did little to feed his soul. Year after year, Ethan watched as his younger colleagues climbed the corporate ladder, securing promotions and bonuses, while he remained stagnant. He wasn't terrible at his job, but he wasn't exceptional either. That lingering sense of inadequacy gnawed at him, and the gap between what he imagined his life should be and what it was became harder to ignore. When he met Sophia, everything changed. She was different from the women he'd known before. Beautiful, confident, and incredibly intelligent, Sophia exuded an energy that seemed to draw people in. She was the kind of woman who lit up a room just by walking into it. It wasn't just her beauty that captured Ethan's attention, it was her warmth, her easy laughter, and the way she seemed to effortlessly balance her ambition with her kindness. They met at a mutual friend's barbecue during Sophia's senior year of college. Ethan, home for the summer, was immediately struck by her smile, the genuine interest she took in people. It was rare for him to feel so drawn to someone. Over the course of the evening, they talked for hours about everything from books to politics, sharing stories and laughing together. Sophia's down-to-earth nature made Ethan feel comfortable in a way he hadn't felt in years. To Sophia, Ethan was a welcome contrast to the high-achieving, often pretentious men she'd encountered in college. He wasn't chasing after the next big thing, wasn't trying to impress anyone. His self-deprecating humor and apparent lack of ambition felt refreshingly real. Their whirlwind romance blossomed that summer, and by the time Sophia returned to school in the fall, they were deeply in love. They married the following year in a modest ceremony in Sophia's parents' backyard, an intimate affair, attended by close friends and family. For a while, it seemed like a fairy tale. Ethan was attentive, affectionate, and eager to please, while Sophia's optimism and encouragement seemed to buoy his self-esteem. Sophia, for her part, saw potential in Ethan. She believed in him, in ways he hadn't believed in himself for a long time. She thought that, with her support, he could accomplish anything. But as time passed, the cracks in their relationship began to show. At first, it was subtle, a few small disagreements here and there, things they could easily laugh off. But as the years went by, the weight of unspoken frustrations and unmet expectations began to take its toll. Ethan's initial contentment with his life had begun to calcify into something more stubborn, a refusal to strive for more, a quiet resignation to mediocrity. Sophia, who had once found his lack of ambition endearing, grew increasingly frustrated. She longed for intellectual stimulation, for adventure, for the kind of life she had imagined for herself. She dreamed of travel, of doing something meaningful, but those dreams were stifled by Ethan's unwillingness to change. Their arguments became more frequent. Sophia would ask Ethan to go back to school, to apply for a better job, to take charge of their future. Ethan, feeling cornered and inadequate, would lash out, accusing her of not being satisfied with who he was. By their 7th anniversary, their marriage had become a shell of what it once was. They were no longer partners, they were roommates. They slept in separate bedrooms, ate meals in silence, and communicated mainly through post-it notes left on the kitchen counter. Sophia threw herself into her work at Ridgewood Elementary, staying late at school and volunteering for every committee she could find. The more she buried herself in her career, the more distant she became from Ethan. He, in turn, retreated into a world of online gaming and late-night television, nursing his wounded pride with beer and resentment. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that Ethan's desperate plan began to take shape. The seed was planted one rainy Tuesday evening in late September when Ethan found himself at Rusty's Tavern, nursing his 3rd beer. He had gone there to escape the cold silence of his house, to avoid the thought of facing another night alone with his thoughts. As he sat there, the flickering neon lights casting a dim glow across the room, he didn't notice the man who slid onto the stool next to him. Caleb Dalton was the type of person most people in Clearwater avoided, rough around the edges, with unkempt hair, a scruffy beard, and bloodshot eyes that always seemed to be looking for trouble. He had a reputation as a small-time criminal, and his past was filled with petty thefts and drug possession charges. But tonight, Caleb was something else to Ethan, a symbol of the man he could never be. Caleb had lived a life full of stories, full of boldness and risk. And as Caleb spoke, his tales of close calls and wild exploits began to stir something in Ethan, a dangerous thought he couldn't shake. As Caleb loosened his tongue with each drink, Ethan found himself confessing his frustrations about his marriage, how he felt invisible, how Sophia had stopped looking at him the way she once did. He spoke about the kind of man he wished he could be, the hero who could save the day and win his wife back. Caleb listened, his eyes glinting with something darker, something more dangerous. By the end of the night, the two men had struck a deal, one that would send their lives on a collision course with disaster. A plan was born that night. Ethan would orchestrate a fake kidnapping of Sophia, and Caleb would be the one to carry it out. Ethan would then swoop in as the hero, rescuing his wife and, in the process, reigniting the spark in their marriage. It seemed simple. It seemed perfect. But Ethan had no idea just how far his desperation would take him. The stage was set, the characters in place, and Sophia had no idea that the very man she had married would be the one who would bring her life to the edge of danger. The day began like any other. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the chill of early October. Sophia Walker was in the midst of her usual routine, teaching her third graders at Ridgewood Elementary, when her phone buzzed in her purse. She ignored it at first, focusing on the students in front of her, the chalk dust swirling in the air as she wrote a math problem on the board. But then the phone buzzed again, this time more insistently. It was a text from Ethan. "Are you free after work? We need to talk." A simple message, but one that sent a ripple of anxiety through Sophia. She hadn't seen him like this in months, almost pleading, like he was finally ready to address the distance that had grown between them. She felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly smothered by the nagging voice in the back of her mind. Was this really going to be another one of their failed attempts at reconnecting? Or was this the moment where things would finally change? The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. Sophia quickly packed up her things, her mind still lingering on the cryptic message from Ethan. She had a meeting scheduled with the school's PTA, but she decided to skip it. Maybe, just maybe, tonight would be the night they could start over. She didn't want to waste any more time. If Ethan was finally ready to face the truth about their marriage, she didn't want to miss it. As she walked out to the parking lot, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. The day had been long, but Ethan's message made her feel like they were on the brink of something important. She was so caught up in the thought of what might happen when they finally talked that she didn't notice the figure lurking in the shadows. Just as she reached her car, a rough hand clamped over her mouth, pulling her backward. Her heart leaped in her chest as the world around her turned into a blur of panic. She struggled, kicking her legs and twisting her body, but the grip was too strong. The cold, metal scent of a mask pressed against her skin as she was yanked into the back of a van. The door slammed shut with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. The van roared to life, tires screeching against the pavement as it sped away, tearing through the quiet streets of Clearwater. Sophia couldn't breathe. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear overwhelming her senses. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Who was this? What did they want with her? But the only thing she could focus on was the suffocating grip of the man's hand over her mouth, the sting of his cold breath against her ear. "Don't scream," the voice growled, low and unfamiliar. Sophia could feel the pulse in her neck race as she tried to scream for help, but all that escaped was a muffled cry. "Just do as I say, and you'll be fine. No one will get hurt." But that was the thing, Sophia knew, deep down, that she wasn't going to be fine. Not this time. Not when everything felt so wrong. The van lurched, taking a sharp turn, and Sophia was thrown against the side. She quickly regained her balance, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel her mind slipping into survival mode as she scrambled to find a way out of this nightmare. But the more she struggled, the more the reality of her situation set in. The man who had grabbed her was no ordinary criminal. He had planned this. He knew what he was doing. And worse, he seemed to know who she was. As the van sped through the streets, she caught glimpses of familiar landmarks, but they blurred into the distance as the vehicle carried her further away from everything she knew. The feeling of helplessness washed over her again, stronger this time. Sophia had always prided herself on being capable, on being able to handle anything that came her way. But this was something else. This was terror. This was being powerless. The van hit another sharp turn, the tires screeching, and Sophia was thrown against the side once more. This time, she didn't have the strength to pull herself up. Everything felt disjointed, the world spinning as she clung to the edge of consciousness. "Stay down," the voice commanded, and then, she heard him swear under his breath as the van hit another bump in the road. The sound of the engine roared louder in her ears, the vibrations reverberating through her bones. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As the minutes dragged on, Sophia tried to focus on one thing, anything, on surviving this. Ethan was supposed to be at home, waiting for her. She had to believe that. She had to hold on to the thought that he'd be the one to come looking for her. The thought of his face, the hope in his eyes when he saw her again, kept her fighting. Ethan would come. He had to. But little did Sophia know, Ethan wasn't coming for her, not yet. The plan he had set in motion that night at Rusty's tavern was already in motion. The man who had grabbed her wasn't a stranger to him. He had been the one who suggested the idea in the first place, the one who had planted the seed of a plan so reckless, so twisted, that there was no going back now. And Ethan had no idea how far it would all spiral out of control. The first hint of the horror that was about to unfold had been triggered, and as Sophia was driven away to an uncertain fate, the walls of her world began to close in, piece by piece. The van, its engine growling in the night, carried her far away from everything she thought. The hours after the kidnapping passed in a blur, but for Ethan Walker, they stretched on endlessly, each second heavier than the last. Sophia's absence was like a weight in his chest, suffocating him, but beneath that suffocating pressure lay a strange sense of excitement, no, anticipation. It was all going to work out. It had to. In the days leading up to October 10th, Ethan had thrown himself into the preparations for the plan. He withdrew the money from his savings account, a small fortune in the context of his modest salary, and paid Caleb Dalton the first part of the fee. Caleb, a man who made his living through shady dealings, had made it clear that the price would be steep, but Ethan didn't hesitate. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something important. Something that would finally make Sophia see him the way she used to. The plan was simple enough, or at least, it seemed that way. Caleb would abduct Sophia, holding her for a short period, and then leave a ransom note with specific instructions. Ethan would swoop in, like the hero he had always fantasized about being, rescue his wife, and prove to her that he was the man she had once fallen in love with. He'd been imagining this moment for days, the relief in Sophia's eyes when she saw him coming to her rescue, the warmth of her embrace as she realized he had done something heroic to save their broken marriage. In Ethan's mind, this was the moment that would change everything. But each step of the plan made his pulse race. He had spent hours studying Sophia's routine, when she left for work, when she took her lunch breaks, the routes she drove. He had even gone so far as to plant a GPS tracker in her car to make sure he knew exactly where to find her if anything went wrong. Caleb had assured him the job would be clean, that everything would go according to the plan, but Ethan couldn't help the knot that tightened in his stomach with each passing day. What if something went wrong? What if Sophia saw through the ruse? What if the police got involved before he could make his move? And worse, what if Caleb decided to double-cross him? His mind raced with worst-case scenarios as he lay in bed each night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the plan in his head. There was no turning back now. No more second chances. He had committed to this. The internal struggle was tearing him apart. Ethan had never been impulsive. He was the type of person who overthought every decision, from what to eat for dinner to whether he was spending too much money on his wife's birthday gift. But this was different. This was bigger. This was the chance to prove to Sophia that he could be the man she needed, the man she had always wanted. Yet, with every step he took toward the day of the kidnapping, a dark thought gnawed at the back of his mind: what if this was all a terrible mistake? His hand shook as he clicked through the final preparations on his phone. He checked and rechecked the location where Caleb had agreed to hold Sophia, a dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of Clearwater, isolated and secluded. The place had been abandoned for years, perfect for a kidnapping that needed to stay under the radar. But even as he made the arrangements, his gut twisted in unease. On the day before the kidnapping, Ethan met with Caleb for one final review of the plan. They sat in Caleb's beat-up pickup truck in the parking lot of a defunct strip mall, the scent of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne hanging in the air. Ethan was jittery, his mind spinning with doubts, but he didn't show it. He couldn't afford to. He had already committed to this course of action, and backing out now would destroy whatever shred of confidence he had left. Caleb was unshaken, his eyes cold as he went over the details. The plan would unfold exactly as they had discussed. Sophia would be taken around 3:30 p.m., when she was finishing up her day at Ridgewood Elementary, and Ethan would get the call at exactly 3:45 p.m., the moment when everything would kick into motion. He'd call the police, play the distraught husband, and in a matter of hours, he would be the hero. The plan seemed flawless. Yet, there was something about Caleb's demeanor that unsettled him. As he spoke, his words were curt, almost too eager. There was a sharp edge to his voice, an intensity that didn't match the casual nature of their conversation. Ethan noticed the way Caleb's eyes flickered when he talked about the ransom. The man seemed far too invested in the plan. What happens if things get out of hand? Ethan asked cautiously. He had to be sure. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Caleb shrugged, as if it was no big deal. The plan's simple. It's all about making her believe she's in danger. We'll keep it clean. Just follow the schedule. You'll rescue her, and then we'll all walk away from it. But Ethan wasn't so sure. Something about Caleb made his skin crawl, and his doubts grew with each passing moment. Ethan tried to dismiss the thought. This was his only chance. Sophia would finally see him as the man he wanted to be. But the closer they got to the date, the harder it became to silence that nagging voice in his head. As the hours dwindled down to the fateful day, Ethan felt the walls closing in on him. His nerves were shot. He was no longer just preparing for the kidnapping. He was preparing for the fallout, the consequences of his actions. What if Sophia found out the truth? What if the police found something that linked him to the crime? He wasn't ready for the devastation that could follow, but deep down, he knew it was already too late. The night before the kidnapping, Ethan stood in the dark of his living room, staring at the clock ticking slowly on the wall. He imagined Sophia's face, her disappointment, her anger, and that sinking feeling in his chest returned. Was this all worth it? Would it bring them closer or tear them apart forever? The day of the kidnapping loomed ahead, and Ethan couldn't escape the weight of what was about to happen. The plan was set. The path was chosen. And as he waited for the final pieces to fall into place, one question lingered in his mind: would Sophia ever forgive him when this was all over? The morning of October 10th arrived with a crispness in the air, the kind of autumn chill that carried an unease, as if the earth itself was bracing for something. Ethan Walker woke up before the sun, his mind already racing through the details of the plan, as it had done for the past week. The house was quiet, the stillness of it amplifying his anxiety. He glanced over at Sophia lying beside him, her steady breathing in contrast to the storm brewing in his chest. He had never felt so conflicted, but the path was set. The only thing left was to follow through. Ethan went through his morning routine mechanically, his hands shaking as he prepared himself for the day ahead. The feeling of anticipation, the kind that tugs at your gut and won't let go, hadn't left him since he and Caleb Dalton had put the plan into motion. As he slipped into his car and drove toward the small insurance office where he worked, his thoughts were consumed by the plan. He couldn't help but wonder, would this really work? Would Sophia ever see him the same way again after this? But those thoughts were quickly drowned by the next, more pressing worry: would Caleb really follow through? For the first time, a sinking feeling settled deep inside Ethan. Around 3 p.m., as Ethan sat in his office, the adrenaline of the plan coiled in his chest. It was happening. Sophia was on her way to Ridgewood Elementary's parking lot. Caleb had said he would take her by surprise as soon as she left, keep her hidden for a few hours, and then the call would come. At precisely 3:45, Ethan would rush to her rescue, playing the hero, saving the day, and perhaps, saving his marriage. But the thought of what could go wrong began to gnaw at him. What if something happened that he couldn't control? At 3:45, just like clockwork, Ethan's phone rang. He nearly jumped out of his seat, his hands trembling as he grabbed the phone. It was Caleb. "Everything's going according to plan," Caleb said, his voice muffled by static, but Ethan could hear the tension underneath the words. "She's in the van, heading to the farmhouse. You'll have to move fast, Ethan. It's time to save your wife." A rush of relief flooded through Ethan. The plan was happening. It was real. But just as quickly, something in Caleb's tone unsettled him. It wasn't the usual calm, methodical voice that Caleb had used when they discussed the plan. It was sharper, more urgent. There was something off about it. Still, Ethan didn't question it. He grabbed his jacket, dialed 911, and ran to his car. As the dispatcher answered, he quickly explained the situation, trying to keep his voice steady, but it faltered with the overwhelming anxiety clawing at him. "Please help. My wife's been kidnapped. There's a ransom note. I don't know who would do this to her." But before he could finish, a second call came in. It was from Caleb again. This time, the voice on the other end sounded different. There was no calm, no reassurance. Just cold. "You need to come alone. No cops, Ethan." "I'm not kidding," Caleb warned. "If you don't follow through, I'll change the plan. You'll never see her again." A sharp jolt of fear shot through Ethan. His mind raced as he processed the words. What was going on? This wasn't what they had agreed on. There was no mention of threatening to change the plan, no indication that Caleb was about to do something unexpected. As Ethan sped down the road toward the farmhouse, the tight grip on his steering wheel became the only thing anchoring him to reality. His mind churned with worry. Caleb had sounded too desperate, too eager. Ethan knew better than to let his gut feelings slide, but the plan was already in motion. What choice did he have but to follow through? By the time he reached the outskirts of town, his heart was pounding in his chest, and his palms were slick with sweat. The farmhouse stood before him, a dilapidated shell of a building at the edge of a field, surrounded by overgrown trees and an eerie stillness. This was where everything was supposed to come together. But as Ethan parked and crept toward the entrance, something felt horribly wrong. He looked around the property and felt the cold prickle of unease crawl up his spine. The air was too still. The familiar crunch of gravel beneath his feet felt too loud, too noticeable. There were no signs of Sophia. No sign of Caleb. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen in place, his mind screaming at him to turn back. This wasn't right. This wasn't the plan. He fumbled with his phone, dialing Caleb, his hands shaking violently. The call went to voicemail. "Caleb," he said, barely above a whisper, his voice trembling with fear. "What's happening? Where is she?" The seconds that passed between each ring felt like hours. But then, the line clicked, and Caleb's voice crackled through, low and dangerous. "You should have followed the rules, Ethan," Caleb hissed. "Now, you've crossed a line. You wanted to be the hero. Now, you'll be the villain." It hit Ethan like a ton of bricks. This wasn't part of the plan. Caleb had betrayed him. Ethan had been played. Sophia was no longer the victim of a fake kidnapping. She was now in the hands of a man who had plans far darker than Ethan could have imagined. Caleb had taken things too far, and Ethan was about to face the consequences. But the worst part wasn't just the betrayal. It was the crushing realization that Sophia's life, and his own future, were slipping further out of his control, and it was his own hand that had guided them down this path. The air in the old farmhouse felt stale, thick with tension and the scent of rot. Sophia Walker sat on the cold, wooden floor, her wrists bound tightly behind her back, the ropes digging into her skin. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she struggled to keep calm. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead, casting long shadows that made every creak of the floorboards echo in her ears. She had no idea where she was, how far they had driven her, or what was coming next. The only thing she knew for sure was that she had to escape. Ethan, her husband, the man who was supposed to be her partner, was nowhere to be found. She had never been so afraid in her life. But amid the fear, a spark of clarity broke through her panic. She could feel her mind sharpening as adrenaline flooded her veins. Sophia was no longer the helpless woman tied up in a corner. She was a fighter, and she would find a way out of this, alone, if necessary. The man who had taken her, Caleb Dalton, had made a mistake. He had underestimated her. Sophia wasn't the type to sit idly by and wait for someone else to save her. She was stronger than that, and this situation, terrifying as it was, would not be her end. Ethan had promised to rescue her, but Sophia had long since learned not to rely on anyone but herself. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting from the broken furniture to the dusty windows, searching for any opportunity. The walls were bare, save for a few peeling posters of long-forgotten advertisements. The only exit was a rusty door in the far corner, bolted shut from the outside. Caleb had been careful to ensure she couldn't escape, but there were always cracks in every plan. She flexed her hands, trying to work her way out of the ropes that bound her wrists. The rough, coarse fibers were cutting into her skin, but she didn't let the pain distract her. Caleb had tied the knots too tightly, but she had learned a few things over the years about escape from her own childhood experiences and from watching too many crime dramas late at night. It wasn't the ropes themselves that would defeat her, it was time. Her mind raced through every possible scenario, trying to remember the details that could help her. She knew Caleb was unpredictable. He was dangerous. His mood had shifted rapidly earlier, from casual to intense, almost manic, and she had learned to trust her instincts. The same instincts that told her Ethan was not coming, at least not the way she'd hoped. She needed to move fast. After several minutes of careful manipulation, Sophia managed to loosen one of the ropes binding her wrists. The relief was instantaneous, and a surge of strength shot through her limbs. She quickly worked her hands free, wincing as the raw flesh stung with the release. She sat still for a moment, gathering her courage and waiting for the next sound, waiting for Caleb to come back, waiting for the right moment to act. Minutes later, she heard footsteps approaching. Caleb was coming back to check on her. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Sophia quickly stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The door creaked as Caleb pushed it open, stepping into the room with a smug grin on his face. His eyes flickered with the cold satisfaction of a man who thought he was in control. "Feeling comfortable, are we?" Caleb taunted, his voice thick with disdain. "It won't be long before your husband comes to save you. But by then, I'll have already made my demands. You know how it works." Sophia didn't respond. Instead, she waited. She waited for the right moment. Caleb stepped further into the room, his back to her for just a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. The adrenaline surged again as Sophia lunged, her body moving faster than she could have imagined. She grabbed a nearby metal chair leg, one that had been broken off in the corner, and swung it with all her might. Caleb barely had time to react. The chair leg slammed into the side of his head with a sickening crack, sending him stumbling back. He crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain, his hands clutching his temple. Sophia didn't wait to see if he was out cold. She had no time to hesitate. She rushed to the door, pushing past the fallen man, her heart pounding in her ears. The rusty door was bolted shut, but there was a small window in the corner of the room, large enough for her to squeeze through if she was quick enough. Sophia didn't think twice. She climbed onto a wooden crate, using every ounce of strength to pry open the window. The glass shattered as she pushed it open, and she didn't stop to think about the cuts that tore into her hands. She scrambled through the window, falling out onto the ground below. The shock of the fall rattled her, but she didn't let the pain slow her down. The farmhouse was isolated, and there were no houses for miles. Caleb would be up soon, but she had a head start. Sophia ran. She didn't care where she was headed, just that she had to get as far from that farmhouse as possible. The wind whipped against her face, but the sting of the cold air was nothing compared to the terror she had just escaped. She wasn't sure how long she had been running, but her legs were burning, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't stop now. Then, in the distance, she saw it, the flashing lights of an approaching vehicle. It was too far to be a threat from Caleb, but Sophia wasn't about to take chances. She dove into the nearby woods, using the trees for cover as she tried to find her bearings. She had done it. She had freed herself. But the question now was whether she could get back to Ethan, and if Ethan was even still the man she once thought he was. The shock of her own survival was starting to fade, and a cold realization set in. Sophia hadn't just escaped from a man. She had escaped from a nightmare. And now, she was going to face the man she thought she loved, the man who had orchestrated it all. The night had fallen thick and dark over Clearwater, the kind of night that wrapped around the town like a shroud, where every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more ominous. Ethan Walker was at the farmhouse, crouched behind a dilapidated shed, his heart pounding in his chest. His phone buzzed again, this time it was Caleb, his voice more urgent than before. "We have a problem," Caleb growled through the phone, his voice laced with panic. "She's out. She's gone. You better get here, now." Ethan's stomach dropped. The plan was falling apart. Sophia had escaped, and now Caleb, his supposed partner in this scheme, was scrambling. Ethan had never intended for things to go this far. It was meant to be simple: rescue his wife, prove his worth, and then move on with their lives. But now, the reality of his actions was beginning to close in, tightening around him like a vice. He had wanted to be a hero, but instead, he was spiraling into the role of a villain. He sprinted toward the farmhouse, his mind racing with thoughts of Sophia. Was she safe? Had she seen through the lies? And what had Caleb done? The man was unstable, unpredictable, and Ethan knew it. But it was too late for second thoughts. He was committed to this, for better or worse. As he reached the front of the farmhouse, he paused. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wood settling. Ethan pushed the door open slowly, his breath coming in short, anxious bursts. He stepped inside, the smell of decay and dust hanging thick in the air. The faint sound of a scuffle echoed through the house, coming from the back. Ethan's eyes went wide as he heard the unmistakable sound of a man grunting in pain. It was Caleb. He rushed toward the sound, his pulse quickening. What had happened? He reached the back room and froze. The sight before him stopped him dead in his tracks. Caleb was sprawled on the floor, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, blood pooling around his head. He was clutching the side of his skull, his hand trembling as if he were still trying to process what had just happened. The faint sound of ragged breathing was the only sign of life left in him. Ethan rushed forward, his heart hammering in his chest. "Caleb," he called out, kneeling beside the man. "What the hell happened? What did you do?" The words that left Caleb's lips were barely a whisper, but they were enough to freeze Ethan in his tracks. "She got away," Caleb rasped, his face contorted in pain. "She fought back, she fought hard. I didn't think she'd be able to. She hit me with the damn chair leg. I wasn't expecting it." His voice trailed off into a strained cough. "You should have come sooner, Ethan. She was smarter than we thought." "Where is she?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling as he gripped Caleb's arm. Caleb shook his head weakly, a low groan escaping his lips. "She's gone. She's out there somewhere. And now we're both screwed." Before Ethan could respond, Caleb's body went limp in his arms, the life draining from his eyes. Ethan stared in horror as the man who had been his accomplice, his partner in this chaotic scheme, died in his arms. There was no escape now. It was over. He let out a strangled breath, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in. Sophia had escaped, Caleb was dead, and Ethan, the man who had started it all, was left with nothing but the consequences of his own desperate actions. As he stood up, his mind spinning, he heard a noise behind him. The sharp crackle of radio static, followed by a voice that froze him in place. "This is the police. We've got him. Don't move." Ethan turned around slowly to see Detective Nora Bennett and several other officers stepping into the room, their guns drawn. She was calm, collected, and the look in her eyes told Ethan everything he needed to know. The jig was up. "Ethan Walker, you're under arrest," Detective Bennett announced, her voice steady as she closed the gap between them. "You've been caught in the act of kidnapping, conspiracy, and, now, murder." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain himself, to somehow justify his actions, but the words died in his throat. There was no explanation that could make this right. There was no way to undo the damage he had caused, no way to save the broken pieces of his life. He had wanted to be a hero, but instead, he had turned into a villain, and now he was facing the consequences. "Sophia," he whispered hoarsely, barely able to speak her name. "Where is she? Is she safe?" Detective Bennett didn't answer immediately, her eyes flickering with something that Ethan couldn't place. Then, finally, she spoke. "She's alive," Detective Bennett said softly. "She's been found. But don't think for a second that matters now. You won't be able to escape what you've done, Ethan. There's no hero in this story. Only a man who let his desperation destroy everything." Ethan swallowed hard as he was handcuffed, the weight of his actions crushing him. Sophia was alive, but what would her life look like now? How could she ever forgive him? As the officers led him out of the farmhouse, Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of Sophia, of his lost marriage, and of everything he had thrown away in his quest to prove his worth. He was no hero. He was a man who had lost everything. And the consequences, both for himself and for Sophia, would haunt him for the rest of his life. The tragic tale of a man desperate to be loved had ended in a way he never could have predicted, a tragic reminder of how far someone can fall when they're consumed by their own insecurities. As the cold metal of the handcuffs tightened around his wrists, Ethan Walker couldn't shake the image of Sophia's face from his mind. It haunted him in every waking moment, the anger and disbelief that would surely be there when she saw him, if she ever decided to look at him again. He had been so sure of his plan, so desperate to fix a broken marriage, but now the reality was more painful than any regret. The scheme had failed, and worse, he had lost Sophia forever. Detective Nora Bennett walked beside him as he was escorted out of the farmhouse, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside Ethan's mind. Caleb Dalton was dead, the plan had unraveled, and Sophia was alive but deeply scarred, physically and emotionally. What would she say when she found out the truth? How could he face her after everything? The officers shoved Ethan into the back of the police car, the door slamming shut with an almost finality that made him wince. The headlights of the patrol car pierced the night, and Ethan knew that there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. He had wanted to be a hero, but now he was a criminal, facing charges that would define the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Sophia had made her way back to Clearwater, her body bruised and exhausted from the escape, but her spirit stronger than ever. The authorities had found her, disoriented and covered in dirt, but alive. Her escape from the farmhouse, though harrowing, had proven to her the strength she had always known she possessed. She was shaken, but she would not be broken. The news of Ethan's arrest spread quickly through town. There was no hiding the truth now. The man who had been her partner for so many years, the man who had once promised to protect her, had been the architect of her nightmare. Yet, in her heart, Sophia knew one thing for sure: Ethan had never intended for things to go this far. He had been consumed by his own insecurities, by a desperate need to prove his worth. But that did not excuse the harm he had caused. As Sophia sat in her hospital room, recovering from the physical trauma of her kidnapping, she was faced with a new reality: a life without Ethan. Her mind was flooded with conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, but there was also something else that lingered at the edges of her thoughts: a sense of freedom. The chains that had bound her emotionally for years were now gone. The woman who had once felt stifled and unfulfilled was free to rebuild her life, on her terms. She stared out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, and felt a flicker of hope. It would be a long road ahead, but she could move forward. She could heal. The life she had imagined for herself, one of independence, of growth, was still within reach. Ethan had made his choices, but now it was time for Sophia to make hers. In the courtroom, Ethan's trial was swift. The evidence against him was overwhelming: his role in the kidnapping, the fake ransom, and Caleb's death. Sophia was reluctant to attend, but she knew she had to. She needed to face the man who had shattered her world, even if it meant confronting the pain that had built up over the years. When Ethan took the stand, his eyes were empty, devoid of the man she had once known. He seemed smaller, broken, reduced to the shell of the man who had once seemed full of promise. Sophia sat in the back, her heart heavy as she listened to him testify. He admitted to everything: his plan, his desperation, but there were no words of apology that could ever erase the damage he had caused. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Ethan Walker was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The punishment was just, but it did little to restore what had been lost. As the sentence was handed down, Sophia took a deep breath. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel joy. She felt nothing but a cold, final sense of closure. Ethan had been punished for his crimes, but she knew that the real work, her healing, was just beginning. Sophia returned home to an empty house. The memories of the life she had shared with Ethan were scattered in pieces around her, but she wasn't sure where to start picking them up. For the first time in years, she had to rebuild herself, to rediscover who she was outside of a broken marriage. It was hard, but she was determined. Sophia knew that her journey wasn't going to be easy, but she was no longer afraid to face it. She had been tested in ways she hadn't thought possible, but she had survived. And now, she was free. What do you think about Sophia's journey? Do you believe she can rebuild her life after everything that's happened? And what about Ethan? Was he a victim of his own insecurities, or was he simply driven by his desperation to prove himself? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinions on this shocking tale. What lessons do you think we can all learn from Ethan and Sophia's story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories and deep dives into the minds behind the most shocking events. Your thoughts and comments help us keep bringing you the stories you love, so join the conversation today.